Good evening and welcome to this debate in the annual Royal Institute of Philosophy series. Previous debates have been about religion with Roger Scruton and Simon Blackburn, and science and human nature with James Ladyman and Raymond Tallis. This year, the motion that's being proposed is the proper aim of art is aesthetic excellence, not moral efficacy. Shall I say it again? The proper aim of art is aesthetic excellence and not moral efficacy. This is an idea which the debate is intending to explore is that. I don't want to say too much because we have two extremely fine speakers, but so often the ancient Greeks have an essential amount to contribute to what in the 19th century could best be described as a disagreement between Tolstoy, who thought that art ought to be a means of moral criticism and education, and Oscar Wilde, who thought that art was and should be useless. It's not meant to instruct or to influence action in any way. It's superbly sterile. The form of the evening is that the principal speakers will talk to up for 10 minutes each to begin with. After that, they'll then speak for up to 5 minutes each in response to what the other has said. That gives us about 35 or 40 minutes that gives us the basis for the evening, and 35 or 40 minutes for the audience to offer questions or short statements and get the debate or discussion going. Finally, the two main speakers will have up to about 5 minutes each to summarise their argument, and then as is formally called a debate, we will have a vote. So thank you very much. I am going to ask Matthew Kieran to speak first, but I'm going to say something about him. He's Professor of Philosophy and the Arts at the University of Leeds. His research focuses on creativity, artistic character, and the intersections between aesthetics, ethics, and psychology. He's acted as the art expert and consultant for Channel 4's Hidden Talent series. His books include Revealing Art, Why Art Matters, and he's co-editor of the collection Knowing Art, Essays in Aesthetics and Epistemology. And before I call you, I'd like to say something about the person speaking against the motion, then I don't have to come back here. Speaking against the motion is Jonathan Jones. He's written for The Guardian, as many of you will know, since 1999. He was a judge of the Turner Prize in 2009. His publications include The Lost Battles, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and the Artistic Duel that defined the Renaissance, and The Loves of the Artist, Art and Passion in the Renaissance. He can be robust. I have an exhibition by Mark Leckey, a Turner Prize winner. He wrote that it looks great on paper, but it's a collection of lumbering inanities. Grayson Perry, he wrote, is not really an artist at all. And photography is not an art, but encourages the fantasy that taking a picture is the same thing as making a work of art. So let's kick off with Matthew Kieran.
Thank you, Melvyn. Thank you very much, Melvyn. Well, ladies and gentlemen, so the motion of the House is the proper aim of art is aesthetic excellence, not moral efficacy. And the way I understand this motion is the following. Art can do many things, but what it is for something as art, that is the pursuit of artistic goals, is to aim for aesthetic excellence, and that's where its primary value lies. It might be able to do many other things, but if it's aiming at moral efficacy and not aesthetic excellence, then we're bound to have bowed out and it's bound to fail. So one thing to bear in mind, and I want to draw our attention to first, is the fact that we are, apart from anything else, an aestheticizing species. Okay? Think about the food we consume and the way we cook. Hopefully you're a better cook than I am. Right? Think about, look around you, the clothes we wear. We make aesthetic choices about the kind of clothes we want to wear, the way we style ourselves. We decorate our bodies, some of us with tattoos, some of us with makeup. Look at the way the room we're in is designed in a certain kind of way to have a certain kind of aesthetic appeal. Many different kinds of architectural styles of all sorts of amazing shapes and sizes. In our homes, we put in all sorts of aesthetically appealing objects. So apart from anything else, just as a species, we're an aestheticizing kind of a being. And moreover, at least across many different cultures and many different times, we've developed this practice, which we call art, which is devoted to, in quite a highly sophisticated, complicated kind of a way, the creation, appreciation of artifacts devoted to rewarding just that kind of appreciation. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean something like good artworks which reward and amplify attention to the quality of experience, or something that's sense-like in experience, for its own sake, independent of any further purpose. And I think not only have we developed that practice because we're a certain kind of species, and we have developed that kind of practice in order to speak to and reward and amplify that kind of interest, but moreover, that this is so explains various features of our artistic evaluation and appreciation. So, for example, what else could possibly explain? Here's Sonia Delaunay, often overlooked in favour of her husband, but less so now. Actually, it's Popova rather. It's formal, right? There's no content. There's no moral message. The use of the colours is beautiful. The edges are quite striking. Perceptually, the longer you start to look at it, you see the way the planes, as it were, cut into and enhance the sense of perceptual depth. It's got no moral, no message. It's that formal aestheticisation which we appreciate. But that's true also explains how and why it is we can appreciate artworks which also have many other multiple functions. So here's a Caravaggio, The Taking of Christ. There are many great things you could say about Caravaggio, who is, I think, a truly great artist, but here's a bunch of features which look very important. First of all, it's important to know, if you know a little bit about Christianity, that this is of Christ in the taking of the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas kissed Christ in order to pick him out so that the Roman guards could seize him. Here's a bunch of features about the artwork which were very different for its time and quite revolutionary. So at the time, normally the works would be full figures. People would show off their kind of classical sculptures. They'd be highly idealized. It'd probably be a narrative painting, picturesque scene, and you see the Roman soldiers coming along. It's not that. It's incredibly dramatic. It's full up front. You get much more emotional impact. But the aesthetic structure of the painting is designed to enhance a certain kind of quality of experience. Look at the fact that the movement is all this way. So it's kind of it's very violent. It's pushing this way, and Christ is the only one, because he is the divine nature, by contrast to all the others, who's able to absorb the violence and accept it in an echo of, well, it looks like an echo of the pose that Mary is traditionally represented as having during the Annunciation. Now, it's got all those kinds of religious connotations, and that's part of the religious message. But look, of course, you can appreciate it as that, even whether or not you agree with Christianity, whether or not you think that theism in general, not just Christianity, is a good thing and morally admirable, or whether, like perhaps Nietzsche, you thought of it as an evil and a morally bad, corrupt thing. You can still appreciate it as art, that is, okay, independently of, as it were, your assessment of the truth or the morality of Christianity and religion. Here's a work by J.R., a French artist, I take it, that has a kind of political and moral message. It's from a series called Women as Heroes. So what you see on the paintings are women's faces, women who in the favela in Brazil normally remain anonymous, not picked out, a certain kind of way. So it has a certain kind of moral message and a moral content. But what's important for it as art, right, is that it, as it were, be striking and appealing in a certain kind of a way and reward your visual experience and discrimination of it. Of course, the moral message might be a good one. I'm not saying it's not. But at least as art, it better be visually striking and appealing in certain kinds of ways. Here's a political piece of art, highly political. So Marat by David, one of the apologists of the French Revolution, celebrating as a secular saint, one of the most fiendish, bloodthirsty mob inducers of the entire French Revolution, painting him as effectively a secular saint. Now, whether you thought he was a good and admirable person as he's represented in this painting, or perhaps as a much more bloodthirsty, populist, death seeker, you can still appreciate it as great art. And you can still recognize that, the blackness of the canvas intimates the death. The marble representation of the skin represents him as holy and admirable. I mean, he had a nasty skin condition, so that's obviously an idealization, right? And there's a bunch of other kinds of things. So this is very humorous. It's trash. It's a pun, right? It's a bronze sculpture, so it's heavy as you like. If you see it in the gallery, you think you'd be able to pick it up because it looks like a kind of normal trash bag, and it's kind of taking the mickey out of people who take the mickey out of conceptual art. It's all rubbish, right? Okay. Of course, it can have sexual purposes, just for delicacy taste. I have my morals too. I'm not going to show you the really extreme stuff from the Shunga tradition, or from Sheila, who was commissioned as a pornographer to paint many pornographic drawings. You can use this stuff sexually for pornographic purposes, but that's not what makes it art. What makes it art is it has a certain kind of aesthetic appeal. And you can be horrified too, right? I mean, here's a work by Jane Alexander from the 80s. Terrific. We like to be scared. We like to be horrified. But what makes it art is, as it were, the aesthetic way in which form is given a certain kind of order and structure to guide our visual experience, which in turn prompts our emotional experience. So look, the aesthetic thesis can explain how and why it is we appreciate many works whose, in terms of actual the moral attitudes or the content, we might disagree vehemently with. And no matter how morally admirable something is, unless it's aesthetically good, then it's not going to be good as an artwork. Whereas by contrast, it's not a puzzle. It would seem really puzzling if someone said the following: well, it's aesthetically a really good work, but it's no good as art. Right? That seems a kind of puzzle or a contradiction, but it seems no puzzle to say the following. Okay? The Caravaggio is great art, but morally speaking, Christianity, or the view of Christianity it manifests, is bankrupt morally. I'm not saying that's true, but it's not a contradiction. Okay. Now, of course, I've said that we have this universal aesthetic interest, and many cultures have developed what we think of as the practice of art to, as it were, develop in very interesting, complex ways that very interest. And I've shown you how and why it is that thesis then explains lots of features of our artistic appreciation and evaluation. But I've not said anything about why art is valuable, because you might say, well, that's all true, but well, maybe the practice should change, right? Okay, maybe we should leave the aesthetic stuff alone, and actually maybe we should change artistic practice to become moral. And I just want to suggest that that would be a bad thing. Now, philosophers, being philosophers, often say, well, art is intrinsically valuable. Well, that might be true, but it doesn't get you very far. It's not very informative, is it? Right? Or aesthetic, it's a special kind of pleasure where there's a capital S. That doesn't get you very far. I mean, it might be true, but it's not very informative. Now, to help us see what I think the value is and why we should hold on to this as part of our artistic practice, I want us to imagine two different worlds. Okay? Maybe in the future, maybe an alternate universe. Let's call the first one art world moralism. I was about to say Morrissey, that would be miserable, but moralism, that's going to be miserable in a different kind of a way. All right? Where the creation and appreciation of artifacts is, as it were, devoted towards the right and the morally good. Well, you know, at least on the basis of past performance, the moralists' record is not very good, right? The Victorians going round knocking genitals off statues, putting fig leaves over things. Tolstoy giving up writing his great novels for those rather pious, sanctimonious little parables. Well, if that's the art world that we're aiming for with moral efficacy, that strikes me as an impoverishment of our human experience. Contrast it with another future world, let's call it aesthetica. Even the name is more aesthetic, right? Let's call it aesthetica. And in that world, well, we have a world of objects of beauty, of wit, of humour, and transgression, moral transgression, and playfulness. A world where art is freed from the moralistic demand that it represent or it express what is morally good, true, or right. And it's not just that we enjoy and value that, but that thing has a certain kind of value, well, intrinsic value, I might say, but also has a certain kind of value to do with our capacities. Because in engaging with these worlds unconstrained, not determined by the true and the right, the morally true and the right, we get to exercise our imaginative capacities and our visual skills. And it's those very imaginative capacities and visual skills which enable us to make sense more generally of the world. So it has an instrumental value as well. Okay? In other words, if we don't close down a world, the artistic world, towards the world of morality, where you just have a kind of artistic palette which will tend to be black and white, our world will not only be richer, more engaging, more beautiful, but we'll be able to make better sense of our world and ourselves. So I propose the motion. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm opposing the motion, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm incredibly not a philosopher. I'm a professional art critic who very much writes, without thinking about it in a way. I've been trying to study and prepare myself for this by reading the history of philosophy. I've got as far as Socrates. And I'm tempted to try and answer Matthew in a sort of Socratic way and say, well, I mean, you talk about Matthew has spoken extremely well and spoken about at the beginning about human beings as aesthetic animals, and we even aestheticize our food. And I suppose Socratically I'd say, well, Matthew, yes, so we had a very good meal last night. It was tasty, wasn't it? It was beautiful. It was a fine aesthetic thing. And did you enjoy it? And was it nutritious? Did you feel nourished by the meal? Or did it leave you hungry and starving? Was it, because of course that would not be a great meal if it left you hungry and starving. And I'd say the same about art. It's not a great meal if it leaves you hungry and starving. There are things that we need from art and that we crave from art, and that both artists and the people who revere art and look to art and go to art all want, which are not captured by the motion, not captured in this idea of art for art's sake. We do have moral needs from art. We do need art to do something in the world. And above all, I think artists need that. I think the motion, Matthews has actually defined extremely well what that aesthetic experience is, but I think it's more tangled. I think the aesthetic experience, unless you're, I suppose, if you're an ideal, if you're Lord Shaftesbury in 18th century England, and your idea of the greatest work of art is the Apollo Belvedere, and you can isolate this thing of an aesthetic experience, which is something that happens entirely in the head. Or if you're Immanuel Kant, you can philosophize that, as far as I understand it. Okay, I got a little bit further than Socrates. That the proper aesthetic attitude is a disinterested one. But in reality, it doesn't seem to work out like that. Art for art's sake, the Wildean doctrine, there's something, it's actually an incredibly refined ascetic, it's not aesthetic but ascetic as well, doctrine, in that it seems to demand too much of us. It demands too much of artists and of art. It demands that a work of art be this incredible pure thing that you can engage with outside other experiences. And by that definition, I think some of the greatest works of art in the world would be bad art, because if a work of art believes that it is morally efficacious, or that it wants to be morally efficacious, and it wants to do something in the world, and it wants to move us in ways that are not just aesthetic, but also, say, political, say, moral, say, religious, then surely that would have to be, those would be flaws in the work of art, because the perfect work of art, by this definition, would be purely aesthetic. So it might be a pure abstract painting which made no allusion to the outside world, whose only possible kind of content was geometric, say, or chromatic. If such an abstract work exists, I haven't illustrated my talk with any abstract works, but I could make the case about a lot of abstract art, that abstract art too engages with the world. But I'm going to stick to some slightly more obvious examples visually. The most obvious one being what many people, certainly I, would think is the greatest painting of the 20th century, Picasso's Guernica. And of course, you could have a response to Guernica which is purely aesthetic. You could talk entirely about the use of black and white, entirely about the references to mythology, its quotation of paintings such as Rubens's Disasters of War, Rubens's Triumph of War, in the Pitti Palace in Florence, and Raphael's Fire in the Borgo in the Vatican. It's a very aesthetically powerful and rich work of art. A painting which unifies the radical aesthetic of Cubism, the dream art of Surrealism, both of which Picasso was obviously deeply involved with in the 1930s, but which is also summons up the history painting, the tradition of the history painting, going back to Raphael, going back to Rubens, but which is, you could say all that, but if you didn't mention the fact that Picasso painted it in order to protest at the bombing of Guernica by the Luftwaffe in the Spanish Civil War, you wouldn't really be talking about Picasso's Guernica, you'd be talking about some kind of fantasy version of it. And I don't think anybody who stands in front of Guernica in the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, nobody can you cannot have a meaningful aesthetic response to Guernica which doesn't include the moral passions that Picasso put into it. And also the moral passions it arouses in us. Guernica is still being used, it's being used now as an anti-war painting. There's a cartoonist did a version recently in which he gives the faces of people like Putin and Obama, and he makes it all about Aleppo. Guernica has in fact become a totemic political painting in the 21st century. Do I think that's the only reason it's good? No, of course not. I think it is an aesthetic masterpiece, but that aesthetic power is absolutely inseparable from its political ambition, its historical ambition, its moral ambition. And I think this is true of many of the great artists of the 20th century. I mean, somebody who writes about art and encounters artists and knows a couple of artists, I think the thing about the idea of art for art's sake, the idea that art is fundamentally an aesthetic thing, and that you can separate that from all the other things that it is, and separate that from moral engagement. Very few artists, I think about art like that, and you'd have to say that artists are all deluded. You'd have to say that most great artists are deluded fools, which again I think is a criticism. I don't think you can say that the ideal work of art, what makes art is a purely aesthetic achievement without damning so many artists, such as George Grosz. Grosz painted this in 1926. It's a prescient painting, given that it was painted in 1926. It's a painting which sees in a kind of icy, vicious, acute way the nature of the far right in Germany at the time, and now looks in retrospect like, why didn't people look at this painting and all go out and fight against Hitler? Well, of course, some of them did, and Grosz was involved with, was active on the left. Of course, when the motion says that art should be, the proper purpose of art is aesthetic excellence, not moral efficacy. You can't really say that Grosz achieved moral efficacy because he didn't stop Hitler with a painting like this. But what he did do was to bear witness, to provide us with an enduring image, an aesthetically excellent image, which allows us to see the truth of modern history, and one that still resonates. Otto Dix, again. And what strikes me about these artists, it's not simply the reason I think the motion, I oppose the motion, genuinely do oppose the motion. I didn't think that I would. I thought I was asked to speak, against the motion, and I can see both sides. But I come more and more to think that it's just not true to think that aesthetic excellence can be separated from all the other stuff, particularly from just from the real. Art is about pain. It's about suffering. It's about the mess of life. All the greatest art is incredibly embedded in life, and you can't take it away out of life and treat it as an aesthetic object by itself. And I think the more aesthetically powerful it is, the more it's engaged with the world. This is Dix painting the First World War. You may recognise, however, that it's clearly strongly influenced by this Renaissance painting by Matthias Grunewald. This is part of the Eisenheim altarpiece. It's not just modern artists who have sought to change the world with art. Grunewald painted this for a hospital, a monastery that looked after the sick. It looked after people who suffered from ergotism, which is a skin disease, and also plague, which obviously involves buboes, and the way that Grunewald depicts Christ on the cross. It was this sort of scarred body. It almost certainly would have been recognisable to the patients in the hospital who saw this in their chapel. It would have been recognisable as an image of the suffering they were going through. And then what Grunewald then shows is this is part of a series of paintings which includes the resurrection. And so Grunewald promises a resurrection, a rebirth out of their pain and their suffering. I don't see how you can, even to call this, even to use the word aesthetic about this work of art seems somehow inadequate and wrong, even though, of course, it's an aesthetic masterpiece, but it's an aesthetic masterpiece which is utterly rooted in the real and utterly rooted in suffering and utterly rooted in fear and hope. And I think art is, and that's why you can't take the aesthetic as something which is outside all that and put it aside. You can't achieve that Kantian disinterest, if I've got that right, or Oscar Wilde's art for art's sake. It's an impossible dream. Goya. I mean, the other reason that art can't be separate from the world in the way this motion implies is that the world comes and surprises us. Goya didn't intend. Goya's early art is very beautiful, very, very lovely, very sexy, very colourful, very decorative, tapestry cartoons. I think there's a strangeness theme to those. But when the Napoleonic Wars broke out, when war came to Spain, when people were massacred in Madrid, near the Royal Palace, history, real life came and grabbed Goya, just in the way that it would grab Picasso in the 20th century. So art simply cannot exist in an aesthetic realm of its own. I mean, Goya is perhaps the beginning of a modern sensibility in which we realise that history is something we cannot escape, and therefore art has to take a responsibility. But having said that, I'm not somebody who would say that art is... I actually hate the idea of art just being about politics or just being about history, and all the works I've tried to show so far are aesthetic masterpieces. They're artistic masterpieces. I just happen to think that true artistic excellence, when we use the term great art, when we say, if you say beautiful art, that might, that's an aesthetic definition, beautiful art, but that doesn't tend to mean so much to us these days. We're not satisfied with that. Great art implies something more than beauty or other than beauty, and it implies, I think, moral excellence. I think aesthetic excellence and moral excellence go together, or let's say moral profundity. We expect moral profundity from great art. That's become our definition of great art, and I think it's a valid expectation. We get that in Goya. We get it in Caravaggio. We're back to Caravaggio. And Matthew talked very well about the... Yeah. 1 second. Right, so Matthew talked extremely well about the aesthetic power of Caravaggio, but I don't think we respond to Caravaggio as an aesthetic construct like that. I think we respond to Caravaggio so powerfully because of the moral power of it. And we don't have to be Christians. We don't have to, it doesn't matter what we believe, but this is a painting of a man being nailed to a cross, and Caravaggio makes you feel a man is really being nailed to a cross. You respond to it as a human being, you respond morally. And I think that great art demands a moral as well as the aesthetic response, and I rest my case.
Rather than, I think we should just sit here and pull the mic towards you. These are decent mics. Just a second. This okay, this mic? Can you hear it? Yep. Well, let's just say sitting here. Do you want to pull it towards you? That'll be the trick. That's right. Now, would you like to have a go at him, and then you have a go at him? Can you?
I'll try.
Just a second. Can you try to restrict it to 3 minutes? Otherwise, we're going to have no time for anybody else. Right. Okay.
Okay. So I enjoyed that very much, and I agree with quite a lot of what Jonathan said. But I'd just like to make 3 points. Quick points by way of response. If it was enough to object to the aesthetic thesis, that is, the pursuit of aesthetic excellence is what art should be about, that artworks have some moral content or have some message or representational content, then, as it were, this this debate would still not be persisting with us now. It's not enough to do that, because the aesthetic thesis does not deny that work can have that content. Indeed, that the part of the job of the artist is to shape and give form and structure to the content in an aesthetically appropriate or engaging way. And I take it that some of the works we've both been showing do that. Moreover, look, I mean, as aesthetically speaking, we enjoy and we delight in paintings which depict or glorify cruelty as well as kindness, which glorify the superhuman, the powerful, as well as the modest and the humble, the sexually licentious as well as the chaste, the vengeful as well as the just. And what matters is, at least principally, whether the form and the structure is given in a certain kind of aesthetic structure which rewards our experience. Otherwise, these works are not even in the game. So I'll just end up with a very quick thought experiment. Imagine there are aliens coming to our world and they wanted to work out what various of our practices were. They had anthropologists and psychologists with them. They left the philosophers behind for obvious reasons. But anyway, the psychologists and the anthropologists with them, and they're trying to sift out what these cultural practices are. Well, look, you can work out what the religious ones are. They involve certain attitudes about deities and afterlife. Work out they've got this thing called science, where they're trying to track truths and regularities about the natural world. And well, what would make sense for our artistic practices if it's not the idea that giving form and structure to our experience, which rewards that kind of disinterested appreciation, is something which is valued and appreciated by people? Otherwise, these things are just going to look like a bunch of other things. Thank you very much.
Your turn.
Sorry, am I just going to... I think, well, I'll just... One more point that I've left out. I didn't go around to. The other thing is about change. And this is my really sort of philosophical thing that I worked out, or tried to, I hope. If aesthetic excellence is the true goal of art, the highest aesthetic excellence in art was achieved by, let's say, was achieved by the people who created the Elgin marbles in the 5th century BC, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci. So why do we need any more art? I mean, we've got aesthetic excellence. We've got, I think the classical tradition is actually aesthetically excellent. And like I say, once you've got Leonardo in the museums, why do you need any more art? And surely that's because art has this responsibility towards the world we live in now. That's why we have contemporary art, and that's why people go and see what might be absolutely rubbish contemporary art, but they still like it because it's about the world we live in, and it's that sense of engagement with, this world now that is needed from art.
Okay, if I start showing people things, some examples about what's beautiful, you might find there's more agreement than there is about instances of what's right and wrong. It's not obvious to me, actually, that morality is in a better place. First point. Second point is, well, look, it might be that people like Hume are right. I mean, just a bit of history. I mean, actually, the term disinterestedness was introduced by Shaftesbury, not Kant. So let's not get hung up about Kant and disinterestedness. I mean, if we're going to do the historical stuff, right? So look, this notion of disinterestedness is quite consistent with the empiricists and the British sentimentalists. People like Hume hold the following, right? I mean, remember, the essay on tragedy is the aesthetics that matter. Of course, moral content has an interaction with the aesthetic stuff. So you might, for example, disapprove somewhat of the Marat or whatever else it is, and that may impact. But there's a criterion of relevance. It's got to be insofar as it relates and impacts on the aesthetic experience.
That seems to be very nearly a summary, isn't it, really?
We'll take it as such.
We'll take it as such. Could you do I'll come back to you for a final pip, but could you do an equally summarising turn? I think the problem with, I believe absolutely in aesthetic excellence. I believe absolutely that the art that interests me is great art. And I absolutely agree that there's an aesthetic drive in the human brain as well. But I just think the human brain is a very complicated, messy place, and also human beings don't live in the abstract, we live in history. And history adds its own complexities, horrors sometimes, as we're,
let's not talk about the current political situation, but I could simply say, look, how can artists turn away and just be aesthetic in a world like the world we live in now? And that was also what artists like Picasso and Otto Dix and George Grosz felt in the 1920s and 30s. I think even in the best possible times and in the best possible situations, which we still are in a democratic country, there are two things. There's the messiness of human beings and the messiness of the history human beings create. Those two things together mean that you just cannot separate the aesthetic from everything else. And aesthetic excellence cannot be achieved separately from an engagement with the world, whether you call that moral or political or whatever you want to call it. And I also think very strongly that most of us would feel that the greatest art always does have a moral, what we would call moral profundity, whether it's a Rembrandt self-portrait or whether it's Goya's 3rd of May that I showed here, or whether it's Caravaggio. It's that moral depth, moral profundity is fundamental to what we mean by a great work of art. One final point, because a couple of people have said we're only talking about the visual. I think it's only when people talk about the visual that they tend to talk about art in this way, because of course visual art, you can say what you like about visual art. It's much harder to talk about, to deny the moral content of novels. I mean, you know, you can't say that Charles Dickens wasn't writing about Victorian England, and you know, his novels are all about the morality and ethics of Victorian England. And I could list, you know, I could say The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. How can anyone think that's not about the nature of America and the American soul? It's much harder to take the content out of literature than it is out of people can, whereas with visual art, people can delude themselves or pretend that the content isn't there. And I think that's a mistake, because I think you then lose the true profundity of art, and great art is moral art.
I was going to, my little end piece, before I come to you for the final word, Matthew, was that I wondered if would have had the same conversation had we been talking about novels, had we been talking about poetry, had we been talking about plays, or does visual art have certain things about it which enables you to talk in the way you've talked, which you could not use if you those terms you could not use if you're talking about novels.
I think my thesis is exactly true for literature as it is for art, because the claim is not that it should not traffic in content. So the claim is just as true about literature. Of course, music, like visual art, can more easily attain what you might think of as the purely formal, because, as it were, it can traffic in the purely visual without the representational content, which is precisely something that literature, it's not that it can't do, but it can't be central to something as literature, that it does that. So there is a difference, but the difference is irrelevant to the truth of the thesis, which I submit to you is indeed true.
Okay, well that's we're going to try out a vote. Looking at what's happened in the last few months, I don't really trust voting one bit. But here you are, here's your chance. The motion is, the proper aim of art is aesthetic excellence, not moral efficacy. Who thinks that that's right? Who is for the motion? Can you put your hands up, please?
Is this a binary choice?
I've said enough. Can you stick your hands up? We're just going to... Who is against the motion? Oh dear, it's sort of a draw. It is sort of a draw. I mean, I'm not going to count all that, but it looks like a draw. Doesn't it look like a draw to you?
An honourable draw.
It really does look like a draw. I'm not kidding. We could have done with draws in other places, but tonight you delivered the great draw. Thank you very much.